Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the second day of the Big Reset Conference. Thank you for joining us. I know that you have a busy schedule, but keep in mind that we have prepared a really exciting program for you today. I'm really excited that here with me online at a safe distance in Australia, from what I've heard in Sydney, is sitting Emilie Sydney Smith, who is the CEO of ExO Works. ExO Works is a company that has a really impressive track record in helping some of the most successful companies worldwide access at transformational innovation. Amongst them, you would find companies like Visa, HP, Procter Gamble, and Emilie and her team help them prepare for the future and actually profit 10 times from disruptive innovation initiatives, which is, the hardest part of innovating. She's a keynote speaker. She's a panelist, a workshop facilitator at many international events. She's sharing mostly practical case studies and practical knowledge. And she's talking about how technologies of access, genetic engineering, 3D printing, quantum computing, machine learning, VR are applied by her clients. Early in her career, she was part of the executive team that drove an Australian startup to $300 million valuation over the course of 2 years. Emilie has also a decade of experience in private equity, evaluating the growth potential of around 100 business opportunities every year during that period. She says that this gave her a deep understanding of the patterns that make business likely to thrive or fail. As Emilie is here with us today, I'm just gonna give the stage to her, and during her presentation, you would be able to ask questions. Our team will be moderating them, and later on we can go also through them. So thank you, Emilie, for being here today. I'm giving the word to you.
Thank you. So I want to share with everyone today why it's so important we address this exponential crisis with exponential solutions. I was in Sofia in February, so for those of you in Bulgaria, in that beautiful city, it was wonderful to meet you, and I wish everyone online all the very best during this crisis for them and their loved ones. I think we all feel like Wile E. Coyote right now, just running off that cliff and trying to understand what to do in the next stages with our company and our lives. But we have always seen this kind of crisis happening. A lot of our clients were coming to us when they saw major disruption over the last number of years. So we look at the biggest companies in the world and believe that at least 30% of them, maybe 100% of them, their existing core products and services will be obsolete within 10 years' time. And so if they're only incrementally innovating on those existing core products and services, they are literally throwing dynamite on that ticking time bomb of obsolescence. And so we see these companies getting blindsided so quickly by so many of these changes happening in the world. It was happening before. Of course, that has accelerated now, but we can use some of the learnings from that previous disruption to help now. And so there was also this phase of new companies that were doing things completely differently to the old ones, the Amazons, the Googles that were just growing so fast. They were doing things 10 times better than usual companies, whether it be faster, safer, cheaper, better customer satisfaction, but something. And so the companies that are thinking that it's really fantastic if they have 10% improvements in what they do, they will be blindsided by the companies that are doing things 10 times better. And so the founder of our company, Salim Ismail, wrote this book. It's one of the best-selling business books of all time. And what he did was say, let's look at these fastest growing companies in the world and see what's shared between them. How can we find out what those special attributes are that we can actually help to take into other companies? Now, it turns out that there are actually 11 attributes that are shared between those fastest growing companies in the world. And we'll take you through some of those ideas during this presentation. But this is the easy way to grow a company. Over the last decade, if you look at the companies that have grown to $1 billion valuation or created new $1 billion business lines, if you do it the traditional way, it's been pretty static, the number of companies that are able to do that. And yet there's been this explosion of companies that are using these kinds of processes to get to that $1 billion valuation. So my message is you can do it the hard way. You can do it the easy way by actually implementing some of these attributes. And so we've been working with this industry base across the world, some very large companies, some very family focused companies as well. And the message that I want to say is we often think that it must be a digital company that is capable of growing fast. And yet most of these companies are actually very physical asset companies. And they're actually managing to bring in these ideas and get back on the growth phase. Now, you can test the exponential potential of your company or any of the companies that you're investing into by doing this 15-minute survey. It will take you through very quickly and give you an email result of how exponential that company might be. But when we actually did this, the company with the highest ever score on that survey was GitHub. Now, GitHub is an amazing company. I've never seen anything like this before. It was sold fairly recently to Microsoft for $7.5 billion, but they had 400 staff, almost no IP, and almost no assets. We've never seen companies being created that have those kinds of criteria and yet are being valued at $7.5 billion. So again, I say this is the easy way to do it. We're also seeing that so many companies are getting blindsided because they're doing innovation theatre. They have these wonderful brainstorming sessions, they come up with cool ideas, and then nothing happens. And so some of the reasons why some of those fail, in fact, many of them fail, 72% of those innovation projects are failing in the US. So a lot of it is that too much theory is going into it rather than actually doing things in practice. And also the corporate immune system that loves to keep things as is. And so we've also found that we can work out a way to navigate that corporate immune system and get things done. And the best way to do this is to use opportunity as currency, live deals that you can take to the stakeholders to get things signed off. So I talked about that idea that there is so many innovation ideas that are taken to CEOs as theory. Hey, wouldn't it be cool if we do this? One of our clients actually spent some time to look at what the underlying talents in their company were and how those talents could be used in a completely adjacent market, a market that they had never thought of before. And then they decided to think big, think 10x, and they had the audacity to go to the biggest potential client in that new industry. And they beat off Amazon and Google and all the other big players that usually should have won that deal, and they won it. And then that innovation team went to the CEO and said, hey, do you want to do this deal? It was a live deal. Who was going to say no to that? It became very easy to get that innovation actually implemented because they used that live opportunity as the currency. We also hear so many companies saying, yeah, we can't really innovate at the moment. Everything's kind of good. We have no burning platform. Well, guess what? Today, because of COVID, we all have burning platforms. We all must do something to change. And so often we need to cut costs at this point. And so I want to start by giving a really practical example of cost cutting that happened. So we worked with Procter Gamble nearly 5 years ago. They've now seen about $500 million worth of return on investment from the work that we did with them. But this one was one of the key ones. They wanted to improve their invoicing process. And fairly quickly, we found a way to have a 50% improvement in that process. But we kept getting people, especially some young people from the company, to keep asking why. But what's underlying this process? And eventually they started to say, is this just a legacy process that we've always done, but it's kind of obsolete now? And the answer was yes. We don't need those invoices. So they literally got rid of $100 million worth of invoices. A pretty cool win by just asking different questions. And that's something that you could be doing every day to try and take cost out of your business. But I think it's also really important to think big at what has actually been going on in the world. And I think that there's been a lot of fake growth in the world. That burning platform was not there because there were a lot of outside factors that were allowing companies to think that they were brilliant and doing wonderful things. And I come out of the oil and gas industry, so I'm absolutely blaming my old industry, where if you look over the last couple of decades, there's been a huge destruction in in shareholder value. And so what was really driving some of that fake growth? Well, billions of people came out of poverty and raised their living standard, and they became consumers. There was this huge drop in the price of so many things, especially when they were digital. There were regulatory moats put up that created partial monopolies that really supported companies to do things. There was this consolidation of competitors. There was this sort of echo chamber of market testing for new products that said, well, we're actually going to ask very narrow questions and not think about some of the other ways of solving the problems that these products and services actually address. And then those companies are getting blindsided by companies that are doing things 10 times better. But this is a big one. This is absolutely crazy what's been going on in the world. Over the last 20 years, the GDP has grown $33 trillion, but the total debt has grown $170 trillion. That's 5 times as much. I mean, that's a minus 80% return. How do we live in that world? Do we want to still be on that debt cycle as we come out of the COVID crisis? Do we want to just keep kicking the can down the road? That's a lot of fake growth that has been going on. And I really challenge companies to be thinking 10x and get off that cycle. But the really exciting thing also is that about every 25 years, whether there's been really big crises or not, there's about a doubling of the global GDP. So the global GDP being around 90 trillion at the moment, that means that we've got about $90 trillion worth of new industries to create. Because actually, I think that a lot of the existing industries, the value is going to drop dramatically, and some of those industries are going to be almost unrecognizable. And so where is that new $90 trillion worth of value going to come from? And how do you play in that as a company? Well, I'm convinced that a lot of it is going to start coming from these 15 technologies that we've been tracking. Now, the ones that are the different color are the ones that might just sort of stay a bit static at these times. I actually think that, we were thinking that these technologies would become ubiquitous in the next 3 to 5 years' time. I think that there's actually a tipping point going on right now because of COVID with most of these technologies. It will mean that there are winners picked this year. Now, we've never actually lived at a time when 15 major technologies are hitting the world all at once. In fact, every single one of them is as profound a change to the world as the Gutenberg printing press made 600 years ago to the world. We've never lived at a time when this kind of thing is happening. And so if we're not building this into our business plans, we can get really blindsided and miss a huge $90 trillion opportunity. Now, I said that I think that there's a tipping point going on because of COVID around these technologies. The first one is that I really think there's going to be a localization of production because of COVID and the broken supply chains. We're going to see 3D printing of a lot of things very close to where they're consumed and also where the raw materials are created. There will be vertical farming that brings a lot of produce very close to the consumer as well, and lab-grown meat the same. Solar energy means that we don't need to ship fuel all over the world, and we're seeing that breakdown of the oil and gas industry. We're seeing a huge push to automation, but that physical automation, the robotics, the drones, the automated vehicles that can reduce the human-to-human interaction. And also when you actually can't have certain populations coming to do various jobs, those jobs are getting automated so fast during this crisis, and they're never going to come back. And so we see that these companies that might have been hopefully on that exponential curve, that blue curve, this crisis has pushed them down to that orange curve. It's really pushed out the timeline for actually achieving things. And yet, because we see that there's that tipping point in that technology, and there's a new way, a new business model out of these fastest growing companies in the world that are doing things 10 times better, we actually believe that companies can get to the point where they're actually on that purple curve and they're actually doing better than they would have if there hadn't been a crisis. It's a horrible thing that we're all going through, but there may be some silver linings. Now, this process can be very much used during crises. So this is a company that we worked with 3 years ago called Interprotección. They are the biggest insurance broker in Mexico. And they were just about to roll out a new product that we had helped them create, which was to take their usual paper sign up for a new policy to digital, which meant that instead of filling out a form and waiting for weeks while it was mailed in and dealt with, people could sign up in 5 minutes for a new policy. Then this huge earthquake hit Mexico City at the end of 2017, just a devastating effect. And 95% of homes in Mexico City were not insured for earthquake. And yet everyone is freaking out that there could be aftershocks. And so this company said, right, we're going to do two things. First of all, they had never been in home insurance before, but they used this 10x thinking to release a completely new product in 72 hours. I mean, that's incredible, 72 hours. And they released that product at a time when their competitors were not releasing new policies for 2 weeks. So they just swept the market. But the second thing that they did was they decided that it was really important to be purpose-driven. And so they actually released those new policies for free with no obligation to sign up after the 3 months. They actually have a 36% sign-up rate on that. And so that doing good while actually being profitable was really important, and it really proved that they could do this. And so time and again, they've actually used this process. They've now actually doubled revenue and tripled profits in those 3 years. And they say it was absolutely this EXO principle process that got them there. Now, as we're thinking about these kinds of disruptions, can we actually think about a new normal? I actually don't think that we can. And so is this just the tip of the iceberg when it comes to disruption? Have we ever seen in history a time of this much disruption when it hasn't caused a massive onward effect? You see empires breaking down when there's high debt without gain. Tick. Inequality. Tick. Natural disasters. Tick. We've got all of those ingredients, and those generally lead to periods of debt restructuring, internal revolutions, sometimes war, the breakdown of currencies, and a new domestic and world order. So the question is, if your company is just starting to feel like they can relax and get into this new normal, should you actually be thinking about planning for much bigger disruptions? And maybe we should also be thinking about what we want that new world to look like, how we want to shape it for the better. And so for a lot of people, this is the first time that they've actually ever really experienced something exponential, that they can really see around them. Of course, that death rate and that infection rate from COVID is just horrible. But there are actually exponentials all around us. Many of us know about Moore's law, that doubling of transistors in computing every 18 months. And it's also an exponential drop in the price of computing that's been going on. And it's hard to get our minds around just what an incredible drop in price this has been. So let me compare this. If, for instance, prices had dropped so much in shares, you could buy every public company in Hungary for 440,000. I mean, that's just crazy, right? And so this is the sort of power of the exponentials that we need to be watching all through the economy. But the really important thing as you're seeing those drops in prices is how do you play in those markets? You actually have to be in a market where the exponential demand growth actually outpaces the dropping price. This is exactly what allowed Intel to become such a huge company, because as those transistors were dropping in price so dramatically, they actually had a huge increase in demand and created completely new industries that no one had ever thought of because of this. And so it's really important to be looking at both sides of that equation as you think about which types of companies you want to be starting. Now, sensors, this is another great example of exponentials. So LiDAR are the sensors that are on the top of an automated vehicle that allow it to actually sense the world. And 8 years ago, that one single sensor was $75,000. And the big automakers went, that's a cool science project, but no one's going to pay $75,000 for a single sensor on their car. And so they just ignored it. 8 years later, it's $500. They're getting completely blindsided, and they're desperately trying to get back into that industry to remain in a dominant position. But that little sensor has actually had a huge effect on the physical nature of that entire industry. We often think that sensors, that the digital side will not really affect the physical, but in this case it has. So essentially that allows a car to be shared and very, very efficient. Most cars spend at least 90% of their time stationary. Now you can actually have shared vehicles that are driverless, and that means a 90% demand destruction. And if you think about those cars, they're actually no longer just a car, they're a software on wheels. If you think about a Tesla, it's actually an app on wheels because it constantly updates. And then if you think about the flow-on effect from that one little sensor, we're working with a large mining company and saying, do you understand that this is $90 billion worth of less steel that will be needed every year? So that one little sensor has really had a huge effect on the world. And sensors are happening everywhere around us. So there are now 1 trillion sensors in the world. There'll be 100 times as many in just a decade, and a huge amount of value that comes from this. In fact, we're creating a blanket, a carpet of sensors all around the world, and they will start to link up and give us an amazing amount of information. My favorite sensor that's happening at the moment is testing for COVID in wastewater. We can actually get a really good idea of how much, whether there's an outbreak in certain areas by looking at wastewater. Can actually find out about 6 days in advance of the usual testing of a human whether there's a problem, which also means that this could be used when a plane lands to actually test the wastewater from that plane and decide whether the passengers actually should be let off into that local community. And so as we think about 100 trillion sensors all around us and linking them up, we will get to the point where everyone can know everything, anywhere, anytime. What a world. What a business opportunity. What do you want to create with this? How do you want to live with this opportunity? Now, as we think about those disruptions, let's dive into why they happen. So if you look at this chart, the black line that's almost vertical is the actual in solar over a number of years. And those coloured lines off the side are the predictions from the major oil and gas body, 13 times. they think that there will be no growth in solar. In fact, the 13th time, they think it will go down. Time and time again, they're completely wrong. I mean, they should lose their jobs. I was in the oil and gas industry and looking at this and believing it until I started to actually see that I was completely wrong and see those exponentials. But we can get so blindsided if we don't actually look out for these things. This is what actually happened in solar. So you have this dramatic drop off in price and this dramatic uptick in the installations of solar. And so as we see these technologies reach the world, these adoption rates, why is it happening that it's just blindsiding us? Well, I love this chart because it really shows us over the last 100 years what has been happening. Over the early part of the last century, it was taking decades for these new technologies to be adopted. You know, the telephone, cars, radio, things that we feel are just normal parts of our lives now. More recently, smartphones, tablets, these have had an almost immediate adoption rate. But the thing that really strikes me about this graph is what's missing down the bottom. That first 10 to 15% of data is just not there. That means that we're getting blindsided because we're not watching when these technologies are just starting to be created. And then suddenly, boom, they go. So what's behind this? Well, you might have seen this yellow curve before. This is the Gartner technology hype cycle. So basically in the first phase of the technology, everyone gets really excited. We're going to have flying cars tomorrow, and the media gets all excited. And then the technology really hasn't caught up. And so there's this huge trough of disillusionment where everyone says, oh, that was never going to happen. That was silly. And then later you get the excitement happening again. But why? So this green curve is the knowledge curve. Basically, the scientists, the engineers, they keep on going. And if we look historically at any of those new technologies, we see the development along this curve, even if there has been that trough of disillusionment. And so you go from that early stage technology that's really ugly, it doesn't work properly, to something that is really beautiful and user-friendly. And so as you think about the adoption that happens over that, you get those early adopters at first, and then that proper solution happens, that tails off a little bit, and then the technology gets to that user-friendly, beautiful stage, and suddenly there's that adoption, like we've seen over the last 100 years with various different technologies. And so we say to companies, if you want to be in these industries, invest along the green curve. Invest along that knowledge curve. And if you're going to get in early, know that there's going to be a trough of disillusionment and invest through it. Because if you try to invest in stage 4, when everyone else is trying to invest as well, everyone is piling into it, there'll be no return on investment left. So be smart about how you plan out these investments. So as we think more about those doubling patterns, we see them in so many different places. This is just a small sampling. So yes, computing power is doubling every 18 months. Internet of Things sensors every year. Medical knowledge every 2.5 months. That's incredible. I mean, what does that world look like? What happens in a very short amount of time because of these doublings? Well, we looked at drones and said, we're actually about 6 years away from the point where drones can pick up the 4 corners of a container. And at that point, you can bring a ship alongside the shore anywhere and just fly those containers off to wherever is needed. And so we talk with large ports around the world who are often thinking about making multi-billion-dollar investments and say, don't, you're obsolete. And especially these new investments, if they take 8 or 10 years to actually build, you will have been obsolete way before those investments are finished. So thinking about these is absolutely vital. So this newborn, Where will he be in 8 years' time with this changing world going on? Well, computing power will be 21 times better. What would you do with 21 times more computing power? That's amazing. Let alone 1 trillion times more medical knowledge. We are talking about a fundamental change in the world. And if you're thinking about business as usual and planning to go back to where we were at the end of 2019, that's a really great way to be blindsided. So this is me when I was 8 years old. And this is when I fell in love with technology. And yes, I had my Commodore 64, but it was early stage technology that was kind of ugly. It didn't work that well. And frankly, I was getting a bit bored of it. That's not why I fell in love with technology. My mother was very involved in the Sydney Symphony Orchestra, and they were really trying to help underprivileged kids. And it was just when cochlear ear implants had come out. And they put these implants into about a dozen kids about my age, and they didn't turn them on until they brought them to a concert. And they turned them on so that the first thing that they heard was the Sydney Symphony Orchestra playing. And watching kids of my age have that life-changing experience, well, if that doesn't make you fall in love with technology, I don't know what will. We often talk about technology as being something esoteric, and we forget how much it's going to change our lives for the better if we allow it to. And so as we think about those implants, so many people have benefited. There's been so much economic benefit from it, and it's priceless. But even those are getting disrupted. That huge market for hearing aids around the world, well, there's now this startup that is offering hearing aids at a fraction of the price. And instead of having to go for multiple visits to a doctor, this can be done online in a very short amount of time. So just a huge disruption happening. I also love this technology. This is a real 10x. So this is portable ultrasound being used in our hospitals right now. So the top photo is the traditional, very clunky, large ultrasound. The bottom photo is one that just clicks into the smartphone. It's 1/10 of the price. It is so easy that it means that a doctor who is worried about going multiple times into a room with someone who has COVID can go in once, change anything that is needed immediately. And there's AI sitting into this analysis of the data to help doctors who might not really know how to use an ultrasound and really get to accuracy very easily and very quickly. This is a true 10x. And so as we think about the people who are great at 10x thinking, Elon Musk is just amazing. Now, his very special strategy is that he looks at these exponentials and he'll design a company to intersect that exponential curve 10 years out. So he knows the technology isn't ready yet, but he knows that it will be, and the price will be right in about 10 years. And so time and time again, he has gone into these new industries, and it's turned out to be a very profitable move for him. I also love what Apple is doing. And we all think about Apple as being that amazing customer interface. And it most certainly is. It's beautiful. But I would say that their real benefit, the thing that really differentiates them, is that they have a stealth team for every industry that is working on how to disrupt that industry. And when they find that there's something that's ready to go to market, they bring that stealth team back into the core of the company, and they distribute that new product at scale through their enormous distribution system. They've done it time and again, whether it's watches, whether it's phones, payment systems. And the question, given that they have a team looking at disrupting every industry, is what will they do next? Will it be your industry that they're coming after? And so as we think about those companies that have been blindsided and how we've helped them to deal with these kinds of issues, I think about TD Ameritrade, which is an online brokerage in the US. At the time, it was about a $25 billion brokerage. It's now been sold. And they suddenly realized in 2017 that their entire revenue was about to disappear. A competitor had come on the market that was offering free trades, which was how they made their money. So an absolute disruption, and they hired us to help navigate that. And so the first of two things that I want to highlight today is that they actually realized that they had a huge opportunity to create a subscription prediction engine. And that was really modeled after what Spotify and Netflix were doing. So instead of, if you like that movie, you might like this movie, it was, if you like those kinds of stocks, how about these kinds of stocks that other people like you have really enjoyed as well? Also looked at what their underlying talents and assets and resources were. And they had a huge branch network, but those branches were kind of pretty empty a lot of the time, really underutilized. And so they said, how can we use them better and really leverage that? Now, the first idea that they came up with, because we had been talking about all these technologies, was, hey, why don't we train locals around technology? And we used our process to say, go and validate that idea with customers. But as they asked people in those local branches whether they liked that idea of learning about technology, the answer was no. And so they kept asking, but what would you like? And the answer was, we would really love to be able to invest in other companies in our local area. We don't just want to invest in the shares. How can we do that through you? Now, here's a really big challenge. The cost of due diligence is about the same for any type of company. Maybe for the big complex ones, it's a bit more, but it's uneconomic in most cases to be doing full due diligence on a small company. And so we brought in an expert who can actually look at different factors about what a company is likely to be able to repay their debt, whether they're investable, but on different factors than we usually look at. And it turns out that there are about $3 trillion worth of potential investments around the world that don't meet the usual traditional criteria, but are perfectly investable when you look at real-time data about those companies. And so this small idea of maybe we can do something with our branches turned into a $3 trillion untapped market with no competitors in it. So a really, really big win by just thinking very differently. So I want to come back to these attributes and how they might actually be implemented. I want to talk you through this idea from Peloton, a fantastic company that has turned the idea of owning an exercise bike into a completely different thing. No longer is it just that boring physical product. It's now a platform business, an $11 billion platform business. So 8 years ago, it was founded. They've had about $1 billion worth of funding. They've had a 10x return on investment for that money. And they have a huge retention rate. Basically, it's almost like a cult following. People absolutely adore being part of the Peloton membership. And so they have this massive transformative purpose, which is one of those 11 attributes, and the one that every fast-growing company has. So allowing people to be the best version of themselves. This is a really interesting, very large, audacious idea. It might sound very simple, but there's a lot built into it there, because they're really saying, no matter who you are, there's no body shaming. We want you to be your best. But it also doesn't say exactly what they do. It doesn't say we're exercise bikes. It says we're going to enable you to do this. And so they've created this passionate community. Community is probably the most important of these attributes after that massive transformative purpose. People can ride together. People have actually created a huge free marketing for this company, because they will post photos of themselves actually doing this exercise on the Instagram account. They absolutely love this company. So the company has almost no expense to market themselves. They've also leveraged assets. So you can either buy a $4,000 bike, or you can say, hey, that bike that I bought a couple of years ago when I was having a New Year's resolution but never really used, now I can take it out of the closet. I'll use my tablet and I'll just have a subscription to Peloton. So they've leveraged the existing assets that were sitting idle in someone's home. Another example of those leveraged assets would be Airbnb or Uber, where they used unused rooms or unused cars. They're a really important way to be able to scale incredibly quickly using what's already out there in the world. The third one is engagement. And so this is creating competition between members of the community, maybe gamification. And so here they have all sorts of badges and milestones that people can actually hit. And it really drives that engagement and that usership. It's why they have that almost 100% retention of their customers. They also have dashboards. And so you can very easily see what's going on with your exercise regime. It's much more user-friendly and detailed than what you would usually see in a digital asset. And remember, thinking about all of the other companies that were putting out exercise bikes, which were fairly boring pieces of physical product. And their innovation was to put a digital counter of how much time and what speeds were going on. These guys have taken that so much further. They've taken a fairly boring physical product and they've seen the emotion behind it, the other reasons why people use an exercise bike. They've leveraged a whole different aspect and grown to an $11 billion company because they've actually understood the emotions. They've also experimented. So when they first started out, they tried with Kickstarter. It was pretty much a failure. They started to open some stores in malls. They then created some partnerships with places like Marriott Hotels. But it was not until they actually said, we can leverage the assets of others and actually create this online platform where people can use their own existing bikes, that this really took off. So that experimentation really worked for them. And I want to also leave you with this fantastic idea. This is something that we've seen so many companies implement immediately. It's very easy to do. So in Amazon, if you have an idea and you take it to your manager, the manager has two options. They can say yes, or they can say no, but they must write a 2-page reasoning, why not, and post it on the company intranet, which means there's friction and there's embarrassment to say no. You know what one of the things that no one could think of saying no to was? Amazon Web Services. It was 75% of their profits, now 50% of their profits, but it's the reason why the company grew so profitable. So this is something that you could implement immediately. And if we think about the pre and the post-COVID world, what should we be changing? Well, we should be changing thinking that 10% improvements to companies are enough. When there are examples of companies doing things 10 times better, we should be focusing on that. Instead of our purpose just being shareholder returns, why shouldn't our purpose be that massive transformative purpose, improving the lives of millions of people? Instead of thinking about quarterly returns only, why don't we actually time our horizons to how long does it take to meet that massive transformative purpose? Instead of thinking about our industries as a single entity that's not going to grow, that dividing up the pie by taking market share from competitors or buying them, why don't we grow the pie? Why don't we think about that $90 trillion worth of new industries that's about to be created and get a bit creative? Instead of thinking of innovation as just bringing in the same software suites that competitors already have, which means no differentiation, why don't we think about innovation more broadly? Instead of that narrow thinking about business continuity that we've seen, where there were fairly simple kind of designs, and then everyone just had to quickly make it up, especially if we're at a point where this is just the tip of the iceberg with disruption. We need to be thinking in a different way about that resilience. We need to be using that data that comes from all those sensors and looking at our companies through that digital lens to create an adaptive, multi-factor resilience. We can do this. So, what kind of questions should we be asking as companies? Well, the first one is a very important one, and we've seen some companies come up with amazing ideas with this. If your company didn't exist and you were recreating it today, what would you do? What would you do differently? What could you achieve? What constraints that existed before COVID have been removed now permanently that mean that you can do things 10 times better? What are the underlying talents of your company that you can use to solve problems better or in different markets? If you were tasked with improving the lives of millions of people, what would you want to do? What business would you create around that? What legacy processes and products are you maintaining for no good reason? Think back to that $100 million win that Procter Gamble had by asking just that question. So we live in this incredibly difficult time, and yet a time where we can create a whole new world, a whole new underlying economic status and process, where we can see the lessons from the fastest growing companies in the world and do things 10 times better. And we're living in a world where we can improve the lives of hundreds of millions of people using these ideas. And so I really encourage you to think big, be audacious. Don't just go back to the business as usual. It doesn't exist anymore. Think 10x. Thank you.
Emilie, thank you so much for this presentation. It's so motivating to see that as the downturn might be slowing down certain businesses, it's actually a huge opportunity for those who are not blindsided and manage to think a bit out of the box. I also really like the metaphor where you said that yeah, let's make the pie bigger. Let's grow the pie. Because I think sometimes thinking in terms of competition is actually pulling us down. And this is not the right approach. As you said, that industries are going to be created in the future. I mean, we need to think about more about that. And it's actually, I believe it's also quite often more empowering to set or to ask the right questions than give the answers to someone as ready as they are. So thank you for doing that for us as well, giving us the right questions. As we were following the chat, we still have a couple of minutes, so maybe we can do one of the questions that were here. It's actually coming from another Emilie O'Neill. I'm going to set the context. I believe that actually investing in disruptive innovation can be risky project. Some months ago, I was in Switzerland in a design and innovation company, which is called Creaholic, and they had this huge sign which was called "Innovation is dangerous," meaning that if you don't use the right methodology and the right mindset, it can be a total failure. So in this sense, investing in technologies with exponential growth is clearly what is going to generate the profits in the future. But how can companies with smaller balance sheets and cash flows set themselves up for exponential growth? This is from Emilie. Emilie, I'm sorry, you have muted yourself. Yeah.
Right, I'm sorry. So, Emilie, thank you so much for the question. It's the small companies don't have a lot of the legacy processes in place that the large ones do. And so in some ways, it's much easier to actually innovate and to think differently and to align everyone from across the organization to do things well. But the most important thing is to take action and not just talk about it. And so I really think that that is the most important thing that every company should be doing, whether they're large or small.
Okay, so the future requires doers, not just people who talk about innovation. Okay, I think I would like to ask you just one short question before we go to the next session. If you would have to decide to invest in one COVID-19 innovation or an innovation that is solving some of the challenges that COVID is currently giving to us, what would it be?
It would be UV sanitation. So robots that will actually use UV light to sanitize everything. I think that the world will move to a point where we actually won't go into spaces if we actually haven't got confirmation that that kind of cleaning has happened. It will be much faster than doing things manually and a lot more thorough. So I see this going into airplanes, into every retail area, into every office, every hotel. That's where I would be investing.
Thank you so much. Thank you. I'm gonna say goodbye to you. I really hope that we will be talking again soon. It was very insightful, everything that you said. I will definitely walk through the slides again later on. Now I'm going to give the word to Alexandra Kuzbunarova, who is sitting in the next room, and in her virtual reality or in her virtual room, she has some guests from Endeavor, Momchil Vasilev, who is the managing director of Endeavor Bulgaria, and their brand new board member, Hristo Hristov, where they will be talking a bit more the right mindset that we should be having during the crisis so that we tackle. This is all from me for now. We will see each other again on stage in the evening at 6 p.m. for the big discussion on business innovation. Thank you so much and enjoy the day.